Good morning. It's Friday, the 5th of April, and this is Govindraj Ethiraj broadcasting from Mumbai, India's financial capital. Our top stories and themes for this day. Markets are strong as investors search for new themes. A strong dollar is knocking more currencies out, and the rupee hits a fresh record low. HDFC Bank is bringing in a large chunk of deposits. Brokerages are smiling. What do India's first-time voters want? An economic lens and an exclusive. The Tata-Vistara pilot crisis, understanding the symptoms of the problem. Asia-Pacific passenger demand is up 52% in February and global is up 21%.
This is a call report with Govindraj Ethiraj.
Markets stay strong, investors hunt for new themes. Now, heat waves have been predicted, as you perhaps have been hearing, including in this show, and the country is gearing up for a long and difficult summer. The markets obviously see these things differently, as they should and as long as they can. So power stocks are up and investors are hunting for bargains in air conditioning stocks or anything that could be connected to hot weather. Meanwhile, the BSE Sensex hit a record high of 74,000 in the early hours, finally closing at 74,228, up 351 points. The Nifty 50 too hit a lifetime high before ending the session at 22,515. That's up 80 points. Elsewhere, gold prices, as we've been talking about here, are hitting fresh highs, and they continue to, now going above $2,300 an ounce on April 4th. And that was posting a record high for the 8th straight day on expectations that the US Federal Reserve will cut rates soon. In India, prices of gold have now hit an all-time high of 70,200 per 10 grams. A year ago, gold was about 57,000. And if you've been listening to anyone who's been telling you to buy gold, perhaps you should have. Oil prices are holding strong too. More of that in a moment, but that's also affecting stocks of oil marketing companies like BPCL and HPCL, which were down in Thursday's trade amidst that persistent rally in oil prices. Another trigger that general investors are watching out for today is the credit policy, which is quite likely to do nothing, or there will be no change. At least that's what's being projected. Strong dollar knocks all currencies out. The Indian rupee has declined to a record low on Thursday thanks to increased dollar demand from local importers as well as high crude oil prices, for which we have to now pay more dollars than ever before. The rupee was 83 rupees 45 paise against the US dollar in early trade and finally ended at 83 rupees 43 paise against the dollar, its weakest closing on record. Elsewhere, a strong dollar is frustrating central bankers and governments around the world, Bloomberg reports, adding that from Tokyo to Istanbul, policymakers are stepping in to defend exchange rates. The key reason: the American economy is strong and resilient, and making the case is now tougher for lower interest rates in a hurry. The dollar has gained against virtually every major peer in 2024, says Bloomberg. China and Indonesia are also amongst countries who've moved to steady their currencies, while Sweden and India, which we of course spoke of, are also under pressure. So it tells you the diversity of countries or currencies which are under attack, in a manner of speaking. Of course, exchange rates do matter because while they help exports, they also increase the cost of imports, including, of course, oil, which in turn could push up inflation. Oil prices hold at a 5-month high. Speaking of oil, we did speak of oil marketing company stocks in India losing ground because of rising oil prices and thus potentially their margins getting squeezed. So oil prices are now close to a 5-month high, a shade below $90 a barrel for Brent crude. Brent, of course, is up about 16% this year thanks to tightened supply by the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, strong consumption, and of course the geopolitical risk premiums between Ukraine's attack on Russia and of course the Middle East, which we've been talking about here. HDFC Bank rakes in more deposits. HDFC Bank is reporting a 7.5% or 160,000 crore increase in its deposits in the last quarter. The amount is high, obviously, given the base, which is high. HDFC Bank's total advances rose about 55%. Aggregate deposits were up 26% on a year-on basis, though the share of low-cost deposits fell to 38% from 44% a year ago. The Economic Times quoted a report by brokerage Macquarie released soon after HDFC Bank disclosed the numbers, saying that for a large bank like HDFC Bank to deliver a 7.5% Q on Q, that's quarter on quarter deposit growth, and even improve its CASA, and I'll come to that in a moment, it is all a fantastic outcome. Now, the share of current and savings account, which constitutes low-cost deposits, is referred to as CASA, which had fallen after the merger with parent housing finance company HDFC as of July last year. Retail deposits grew about 28% over March 31st, 2023, and there are other promising figures on consumer loan growth among other categories. HDFC Bank stock price was up yesterday, and Macquarie says this is a great time to add a quality franchise like HDFC Bank. Veg thali prices rise further. Rating agency CRISIL has put out its monthly thali price, or the price of a full Indian meal plate, saying that the cost of a home-cooked vegetarian thali has increased 7% in March to about 27 rupees compared to 25 rupees in the same month in 2023. On the other hand, a non-vegetarian thali's price has decreased 7% to about 55 rupees from about 59 rupees in the same period. A vegetarian thali comprises rotis, onions, tomatoes, potatoes, rice, dal, and curd, and salad. A non-vegetarian food thali has the same foods but chicken instead of dal, at least for the purposes of computation. The shift in prices are a measure of inflation. In the case of vegetarian food, prices of onions, tomatoes, and potatoes have risen by anywhere between 40% and 22% annually. If you were to go month on month, veg thali prices are down slightly compared to February 24, and non-veg thali prices are up, although this could be seasonal and driven by festivals. CRISIL said it expects wheat prices to decline with fresh harvests arriving in the market, but tomato prices would stay benign, or I guess around these levels. And onion prices, however, could see some near-term firming up because a Rabi harvest is seen as 20% lower. What are India's first-time voters wanting? The 2024 elections will see some 18 million first-time voters cast their ballots. A new and just out study, into which we will delve into in much more detail in coming days and weeks by polling firm CVoter, has brought out some interesting insights on what first-time voters think, and more importantly, how does this compare with their predecessors over the decades? An important insight: the shelf life of issues has reduced. This means that you may not be so influenced by what happened even maybe a few months ago, however important it was, compared to your predecessors who perhaps could stick to an issue or continue to be influenced by an issue over a much longer period, maybe even a couple of years. I reached out to Yashwant Deshmukh, founder-director at CVoter, and I began by asking him what was or had changed in young voters' minds and what were the key differences as the data went back over 50 years, particularly from an economic lens that this show focuses on.
Well, we have been doing the first-time voter survey for long, but that was limited to the first-time voter of that particular election. What is unique about this study is that we wanted to check what were the issues and the context of the first-time voters in different elections, in the past as well. Because there is no timeline available. Survey science is fairly new in India. The only place where you could get some data of the past was probably in the late 60s, early 70s for CSDS, but not before that. So we were wondering what kind of response could have been there, if they were asked at that point of time. And for that purpose, we experimented with something which we did in our previous relief and rehabilitation surveys in post-tsunami and earthquake areas about understanding the quality of life before tsunami, after the tsunami. So it was a contextual analysis, asking the same well-being index questions into three different categories. How did you feel before, in that particular timeline before tsunami happened, right after tsunami, and how do you see yourself right now after 10 years down the lane post-tsunami, and something of that sort. So I checked with my team if we can do the experiment on this one, and they came up with an instrument which was quite unique and fascinating because it was an all India national representative survey. Where obviously the age group ranged from 18 years old to 101 year or 102 years old. Different kind of age group people were there. And we actually, for each generational group in a decadal one, like those who voted for the first time in 1950s, the decade of 50s, decade of 60s, 70s, and so on and so forth in the last 7 decades and plus the current one. And we asked them if they could tell us which was the first election they voted in, you know, and which election was that? Was it a Lok Sabha election or an assembly election or a local election? And what were the issues when they voted at that point of time in their mind? What were their issues and, as the first time voter? So that is a fascinating way of looking and comparing the data of different generations across the age spectrum.
And it's fascinating that a 101-year-old person has responded to your survey. Would you know who this person is? Not by name, but where they are demographically?
Of course, yes. Of course, yes. The gentleman happened to be in Haryana. So we know, and we do come across quite, very regularly, some or the other who is 95, 96, even 100 years old. Like that kind of thing. We do come across people like that. Even Election Commission also recently, from their age group analysis, gave a list of people who were, quite a significant number of, we never knew that there were so many people who are 100 plus in India. But in Election Commission just made a release on that. Yeah.
So between the earliest data that you could get from this survey and today, what are the common factors and what are not in terms of the way people make their electoral choices?
Well, there were some really common things and somewhere very unique things as well. Say, for example, what I found was interesting that between the two spectrums of the age groups across the thing, the youngest and the oldest, the way they recall their first election, the identity in terms of leadership, that was critical and important. The issue of unemployment, jobs, the future, that was critical and that remained the same. That's an interesting thing because that age group is pretty much focused on what their future is holding. Identification with the leadership was very interesting to know. But at the same time, we could also sense that different decades offered some different local and national issues, national level issues, which kind of, I won't say swayed, but which made that generational political choices rooted into some of the really broad contour issues. For example, people who voted in the late 60s or who voted in the late 70s, the China war and after effects, they had its own sentiment on that. Similarly, the decade of 70s, one week also, the first half was pretty much influenced by the Bangladesh war, but the second half of the 70s were pretty much influenced by the post-emergency period. So we could sense that in the last 7 decades of electoral politics in India, there were some decadal trends where the definition of politics in India or political approach in India was defined by some really big issues or things that happened in that decade and that they continued. So we found that the generation of the 70s was more rooted for non-Congress, anti-Congress politics and which had roots into even the non-BJP side, non-BJP, non-Congress political side. But over a period of time, we could sense that when we talk to them about their today's political choices, we see that anti-Congressism at that point of time became converted into pro-BJPism at some point of time because the regional anti-Congress factions did go down and BJP pulled out that, sucked in that vacuum in that way. So that's a very fascinating way of looking or substantiating it with the data, which was kind of known because we know that 70s generation is, we call them as the emergency, post-emergency generation. If you talk to the majority of the politicians who are non-Congress, they will easily say, hum JP movement ke log hain. That they recollect the 70s politics in that. Same goes in the 60s way. Same goes in the 89 to 91 and so on and so forth and like that. So one very interesting thing which I observed was the generation which came after economy opening up. That's a massive turning point, the way the youngsters think and the way they approach the politics, Before economy opened up, the previous generation was more fixed on one ideological or one thought process of sort. Post economy opened up, the open economy generation seems to be more consumerist in their approach. If they deliver, they are okay. If they do not deliver, they are not okay. It's a very pretty pretty consumerist approach in that way.
Right. And if you were to look at the choices that people are making now, I think one of the things you're pointing out that there is a clear preference for a single leader. In this case, I'm assuming it's Narendra Modi. But if you were to view the same thing through an economic lens, in terms of economic aspirations, livelihoods, and jobs, what are first-time voters saying today?
Well, economic aspiration is like the biggest thing which I am sensing qualitatively as well when I was getting briefed by my researchers, is that the line between luxury and necessity has taken a big hit over the generations. Things which were very, very difficult to get. Say, for example, my generation, I include now myself in the old generation, by the way, for a simple reason, but probably, I was talking to my daughter the other day and she is in grade 10 and I told her that, my generation is the generation which saw, telephone line as the landline, as the last one probably, and that too not the push button, the karr wala, and my generation which saw the STD coming into the place, because earlier it used to be the trunk call. We remember the trunk calls. TV happened, the color TV happened in front of us, the satellite TV happened in front of us. And as a journalist, you know it, Govind, we were the generation where we made the transformation from print to TV, because when we came into media, there was no TV, only Doordarshan was there. So when I look into that kind of a lens, and I understand that the changes that have happened at such a rapid speed, that it is very natural that a lot of things which we used to consider luxury are basic necessity for this new generation. And once the basic necessity is provided, they take it for granted. And then to make it an electoral issue out of it is possible only for one election cycle. Once they have taken it for granted, they do not really take it as an election issue the next election cycle. Ye to de diya, kar diya. What next? What else you are offering? So the shelf life of issues and shelf life of what the government or people in power offer, that shelf life has reduced a lot. Now compare that to something like Operation Barga in West Bengal, which kept CPM in power for 30 years. If Operation Barga would have happened today, it will have only a shelf life of 5 years, because the next cycle they will take it for granted. So these changes are fascinating to observe. And I know we are talking elections, but when I look into the economic and consumer side kind of thing, it's amazing to see how consumerism is driving the electoral sentiment. Voters are the new consumer. That concept that came out from my data, that, earlier voters were not really treated as consumers. We used to have different shades of studies. Consumer study was considered so different from a voter study. Of course, they are different. But to think of that this new generation is no more a voter, she is a consumer, And probably the political parties will have to look into that phenomena very closely when offering their product, when offering how they are going about it.
Thank you so much for this. And I think what you've done is given us a taste of this study and what lies ahead. And I obviously look forward to returning with you and other common friends and economists to maybe dive a little deeper in the next week or so. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Pleasure, Bhuvi.
The Vistara Air India merger blues continue. After some 120 flights were cancelled because of pilots not turning up over the last 3 days, the situation has somewhat improved as operations have stabilized at Vistara, the Indian airline. Pilots were upset with lower compensation levels ahead of a merger with Air India, whose parent Tata owns a 51% stake in Vistara. The balance is held by Singapore Airlines. Money Control is reporting that 2 Air India pilot unions, meanwhile, wrote a letter to Tata Brass in support of Vistara's pilots, urging the leadership to engage in constructive dialogue with pilots and take proactive measures to address their grievances. In a joint letter, the Indian Commercial Pilots Association and the Indian Pilots Guild said that issues pertaining to reduction in minimum guaranteed flying allowance to 40 hours, leave approval and roster malpractices extend to all Tata Group airlines. That's Air India, Air India Express, which also includes AirAsia India. The pilot union said that pilots are being exploited, overworked, and deprived of their basic rights. Vistara may also consider a reduction in its network as it's been running on full capacity, leaving little margin for error, according to what the senior leadership of the airlines told employees in a town hall in the 3rd of April, according to what Money Control is reporting. Now, to sum up what's been going on, including a better understanding of what pilots are exactly upset about and the nuances within that, and of course, the outlook for the airline and whether or not you should be holding on to your tickets. I'm joined by Sanjay Lazar, aviation consultant who spent close to 38 years in Air India, including managing in-flight crews.
Essentially, Tata's bought Air India in early 22 and took over, and they already had a stake in one carrier. In 2021, they had bought over the majority stake in Air Asia, which they had a holding also already. So in effect, they had already got 4 separate carriers in their bouquet. Now, the steps to go forward were complex. But, very few people realize that in the background of this entire scenario was their partner in Vistara, Singapore Airlines. Now, between Singapore Airlines and its holding company, Temasek, they have stakes in Vistara. They have stakes in AI SATs. They control 6 airports in India. So literally, it was more of a Tata play for Air India, but a Singapore play for the Indian aviation market. So I know there are a lot of people out there, and I've listened to your show yesterday, which said, spoke of the merger. Should we wait or should we not? Singapore can't really wait. And that's a point we don't understand. Many of us Indians say, Vistara is wonderful, let's hold on to it and nurture it while Air India recovers. But Air India has been there, done that. They're growing. The entire planning was based on making one mega carrier or 2. So now they've got one low-cost model, which is a merger of Air Asia and Air India Express. And they've got the Air India Vistara model. Of course, they'll take the best of one and merge it with the other. And they started this process last year. They got a company called Boston Consulting in to deal with purely the pilot and operational crew mergers. So Boston Consulting formulated a seniority list, a rationale for more. You see, because Air India Express had one type of aircraft, Air Asia had a different type of aircraft, Air India had 4 types of aircraft, Vistara had 2 types of aircraft. So you had, an amalgam of 5 or 6 aircraft with 5 or 6 seniorities. So this was 4 times the problem Air India and Indian Airlines had during its mergers. So they got a professional team, and BCG gave its report, and they formulated a ratio. 1:3 pilots at Vistara will come in the seniority list. 1:11 will be for the LCC, that's Air Asia and Air India Express. And you'll have a common seniority list. Pilots will move from one to the other. Now, the problem here was that emoluments differed across the aircraft and across fleet. So they started rationalizing them. It so happened that the unions at Air India at that time were opposing it very strongly. Go Air happened. We all know what happened. It shut down. It bled over the market. We had pilots standing in line outside the Taj Mansingh waiting for jobs. And you had, whole lot of... So Air India had a, flush of people in. So let's say opposition to the 70 hours reduction at Air India was quelled. They signed on the dotted line. Now, a year later comes, because then in 22, they started the merger of Vistara Air India. They got permission from the Competition Commission of India, I believe in September of last year. That's 23. I believe on the 5th of March this year, they got permission from the CCS of Singapore to merge, subject to certain conditions, because Singapore Airlines also is a dominant partner here. And between the 3 carriers, they would control all traffic between, Southeast Asia and India. So having done all that, they started applying the same, cut-paste formula of Air India onto Vistara. Now, Vistara was getting 70 hours at a time when Air India was getting 40 hours. So actually, they told the Vistara pilots, you take a cut to join the bigger carrier. Now, this worked for some, because what they did was they raised the per hour rate at certain categories, and they reduced it at certain categories. So the seniors got more, the juniors got less. And this is where it pinched, the toes of the pilots. So they said, no, we don't want to earn a lakh less. We're earning only 2 or 3 lakhs. And the guys who are earning 7 or 8 are going up to 10. So it's absolutely unfair. You're putting me in a disadvantage. Now, it so happened that, the strange leave rules also at Tata, Air India, Vistara are that at the end of the financial year, at 31st March, your sick leaves lapse. So if you've not been utilizing them, you lose them. It's use or lose. The Vistara management had not yet recruited a lot of pilots over the previous year. So they're really, really tight. The 787s weren't flying. They transferred 24 pilots from Air India to Vistara to operate those aircraft. So what happened is a lot of leave was not granted during the year. These guys reported sick in whether it's as a collusive effort or not, we don't know. They've all denied it. So as the CEO, he said, no, they all felt sick. They were fatigued. They were tired. It was our bad rostering. Fair enough. He was man enough to admit. But be that as it may, it caused the disruption of more than 120 flights. Passengers were severely inconvenienced across the network. Vistara paid a lot of money out to passengers, or is paying, or will compensate them. And here is where we are. They are asking, these first officers are asking that their payment or their emoluments not be reduced when they go into the new carrier. Simple. If you're in one news organization and you're moving to another news organization, you don't expect to take a hit unless you've lost your job here. So that's how it is currently.
Got it. Okay, so now I think you've summed it up pretty well, and including some of the nuances involved, which is that there are many types of aircraft, there are many types of seniorities, and as would be the case. So how is this likely to now play out in coming months? So, again, two questions. One is more strategic, which is, let's say, a top-down view. And the other is really as a consumer, which is that, if people are holding tickets for Vistara which is in 10 days' time or 15 days' time, should they be bothered?
Two things. Before I just get to that, I want to add one aside here, which I thought was very interesting. The day after I appeared on a TV channel, the day after I appeared, I met a retired HR's, veteran. So he said, "Hey, Sanjay, I saw you. What nonsense is this?" So I said, "Listen, they're losing $1 lakh a month." So he said, "How many are they?" I said, 50. He said, "That's 6 crores a year." He said, 120 flights delayed. How much compensation did Vistara pay the passengers? He said, at 100 passengers per aircraft, they paid 10 crores at a minimum. If they pay 2,000 rupees per flight, that's 20 crores. This is why are they fighting? They could have reached some midway. This is just to give you an idea. Now, we know that 21 pilots have said they want to resign. 10 more are likely to do that. Now, what is it going forward? I believe the CEO and the chairman of Vistara, Mr. Bhatt and Vinod Kannan, took the right steps. Mr. Bhaskar Bhatt was very candid when he apologized to passengers and to his staff and said that it would never happen again. I think the CEO, Vinod Kannan, went out on a limb and did a town hall with all of them, which was, it takes a big man to come out and say, "I'm sorry and I've made a mistake." And I think they did that. And I know true JRD style, actually, because I've met him, I've dealt with him. I'll tell you, this is what leadership is about. And I think remarkable steps. He said, "I will sit down with each one individually and resolve their problems." So going forward, I do believe that they will find a midway. I don't think everybody is fixated on the money. They also want their social life. They want to be relieved from this stranglehold of uniform to uniform. There is no life because you're short of pilots. They're literally flying 6 days a week and, almost 24/7 up to the limit that the regulator permits. I think they'll all step back for a little money and give leeway. What does it mean for customers and consumers and passengers like you and me going forward? I don't think there's any cause for worry if we're holding Vistara tickets. They're rock solid. They're Tata, so you can bank them. And I believe this should ease out in the next 2 days. Already we've seen today almost little or no cancellations. They were restructuring. By Friday, it'll be ironed out. By Saturday, I do believe everything will be back to normal. What does it mean for the group going forward? This is an issue that has to be addressed at some level. Either you give proper rostering, and the CEO promised. He said, "We are short of pilots. We've not grown. We've not recruited enough. And, we maybe have some lacuna in this. We can sit and sort this out." And I believe, like I say always, talking solves wars. This is nothing. We can do this in a cinch. So that's how I see it.
Sanjay, thank you so much for joining me on this.
Thank you so much.
Air traffic up in Asia and globally. So the baseline problem, perhaps affecting Indian airlines in general at this point, is clearly that demand is higher than capacity, including of pilots. Meanwhile, I don't know if this makes you happier or not, the International Air Transport Association has said that total demand measured in revenue passenger kilometers was up about 21% in February 24 compared to February 23. Total capacity, meanwhile, was up about 19% year on year. International demand rose 26% compared to February 23, and IATA has said that this is for the first time that demand for international services has exceeded pre-pandemic levels. Now, this is somewhat skewed by the fact that February 2024 had an extra day compared to the previous year, but the figures are obviously pointing in the upward direction. Asia Pacific Airlines, more importantly, saw a 53% year-on-year increase in demand, while capacity increased 52%, with a load factor close to 85%. So all of this could help you understand why ticket prices are refusing to come down. That was the Core Report with me, Govindraj Ethiraj. Do stay connected with more of our coverage at the Core. You can check out our website or sign up to our newsletter for our exclusive stories, one in-depth feature a day on www.thecore.in. Do also track us on LinkedIn, where we usually post synopses or extracts of our top stories and interviews. We would love your feedback on how we can make business more interesting and relevant, including, of course, India's vibrant manufacturing sector. So write to us at feedback@thecore.in, and thank you once again for listening.